The boats crossed the black water without anyone rowing them. Harry Potter sat in the prow of one, watching the castle grow. He had seen Hogwarts from the far shore and thought, briefly, that he understood its scale. He had been wrong. The closer the boats got, the less the castle seemed like a structure, and the more it seemed like a fact, something the landscape had always contained, as though the mountains had simply grown up around it, rather than any human hand having set one stone on another. Every tower had a lit window. The whole thing was doubled in the lake below, wavering darkly in the wake of the boats. Ron Weasley had run out of things to say around the halfway point. This was notable. Ron had been talking since King's Cross. "Nearly there," said someone behind them. Hermione Granger, who had been identifying the towers by name since they left the pier, working from a floor plan she had apparently memorized from Hogwarts, a history. She had managed 5 before Ron asked her to stop. The boats nosed into a low cave beneath the castle and docked. Then there were steps, cold stone underfoot, wet grass outside, more steps, and at last a torchlit passage where Professor McGonagall was already waiting. She was not tall, but she stood with the bearing of someone who had decided long ago that height was beside the point. Her dark hair was pulled back without a single strand permitted to escape, and her square spectacles caught the torchlight as she looked the cluster of first years over. Her tartan robes were precisely pressed. "Welcome to Hogwarts," she said. Her voice was brisk and clear and left no room for doubt. "Shortly, the sorting ceremony will begin and you will enter the Great Hall. Before that, compose yourselves. The sorting is one of the most important events of your time here. Take a moment to understand that." She led them to a small adjoining chamber and left them to do exactly that. Neville Longbottom, standing at Harry's elbow and looking as though he might shortly be sick, said, in a voice barely large enough to count, "She seems kind." Nobody answered him. The Great Hall could not be prepared for. Harry had been told about the ceiling, enchanted to reflect the sky, Ron had explained on the train. But knowing that did not diminish standing beneath it. Above them spread an expanse of deep night sky, cloud and scattered star, with dozens of candles hanging unsupported between the darkness and the 4 long tables, throwing warm gold across the faces of hundreds of older students who had turned to watch. At the far end of the hall, on a raised dais, a battered and much-patched hat sat slightly askew on a 3-legged stool. A wide rip near its brim moved like a mouth, and then the hat, without any further ceremony, began to sing. Harry could not have recalled the song word for word afterward. It covered the 4 houses and what each of them valued: courage, industry, intellect, cunning, and something about how strength came in forms that could seem to contradict. What he held on to was the ending, quiet enough to miss. 2 threads uncut since the age of Arthur's grief. Await the hands that prove them, not the hands that seek. Every professor at the high table had turned to the neighbor on their left or right. Every professor except one. Dumbledore sat perfectly still, his half-moon spectacles directed at the first years, and his expression gave Harry nothing at all. The names began. Harry stood near the back of the group and counted deliberation times in a way he could not help. Then, "Granger, Hermione." She walked to the stool with her chin level and her hands at her sides, the posture of someone who had rehearsed arriving somewhere important. She sat. The hat fell over her bushy brown hair, and she went very still. 4 seconds passed before it announced its verdict. When she lifted it off, her expression was a careful blankness, the look of someone who hadn't yet decided what to do with what she'd been told. She walked to the Gryffindor table without looking back at the waiting group. What Harry could not hear was what the hat had said to her privately, in the moment before. Muggle-born, you say? The blood says otherwise, further back than your family's memory reaches. A squib's line carries more than it knows. Gryffindor. Longbottom. Neville sat beneath the hat for what felt, to the watching group, like rather too long, and then became a Gryffindor. The relief among the remaining first years was general. Several names later. Potter. Harry. The hall went quiet in a specific way. He walked to the stool with his eyes ahead and sat down, and the hat came over his face, and everything went dark and smelled of old cloth and something older. A difficult one, said a voice that was not quite a sound, somewhere just behind his eyes. Plenty of courage, I see. Not bad brains, either. Talent? Considerable talent, yes. And something that says Slytherin, rather insistently. Harry thought, with everything he had. Not Slytherin. Not Slytherin, the hat agreed, with something that might have been patience. Very well. Gryffindor it is. He was already lifting the brim when it continued, low and unhurried. There is more to you than a scar and a prophecy, boy. The oldest of lines stirs when I touch you. Slytherin once carried this thread. Now you carry it in Gryffindor cloth. Gryffindor, the hat announced, and the red and gold table erupted. Harry walked toward the sound, with those last words still somewhere in the back of his skull. He sat down. He smiled when smiling was indicated. The words were still there. The feast appeared all at once, and the first years collectively remembered they had not eaten since noon. Ron, tall, red-haired, freckled, already mid-sentence with a second year he had never met, pushed a chocolate frog card across the table without breaking stride. Dumbledore. I've got about 5 of him. Harry turned it over. Albus Dumbledore, silver-haired and blue-eyed, gazed from the card with the calm of someone accustomed to appearing on collectible items. Supreme Mugwump, Chief Warlock, defeater of the Dark Wizard, Grindelwald. The actual Dumbledore at the high table at the far end of the hall had not looked up from his goblet. 3 seats along, Hermione had opened her own chocolate frog. The frog leapt away before she noticed, which she didn't. She was looking at the card with the same careful blankness she had worn coming off the stool, working through something she was not ready to name. When she tucked it into the pocket of her robes, he caught a corner of it. A woman's face, dark-eyed and severe, and a name in small print. Morgan Le Fay. He didn't know what the oldest of lines meant, or what a prophecy was that the hat had mentioned, as though he already knew about one. He had a scar he'd carried since before memory, and he now had several new unexplained things alongside it. He reached for the chicken. That part, at least, was straightforward. Long after midnight, when Gryffindor Tower had gone quiet, Albus Dumbledore climbed to his office alone. He sat at his desk without lighting anything. Then he opened the bottom drawer and removed the small leather volume, its spine wrapped in a strip of cloth, older than most of the building around it, and turned to the current year's entries with the care of a man reading a page he had, for many years, declined to let himself look for. Each entry was brief. A name, a house, the hat's notation in its own particular ink. He found Potter, Harry. The notation was 3 lines. He found Granger, Hermione. The notation was 4 lines, and said, in essential terms, the same thing. Dumbledore read both entries twice. Then he sat for a long time without reading further. Below, in Gryffindor Tower, 2 children who had arrived at Hogwarts this evening, as a boy who lived and a Muggle-born girl, were sleeping soundly, without the faintest idea what the oldest magical artifact in Britain had just confirmed about each of them. He closed the book. He did not put it back in the drawer. He had been careful in such matters, destiny, bloodlines, the patience of things that waited longer than living memory, for a long time. He was, as a rule, careful enough. He suspected this would require something more. He sat in the dark with the book in his hands and thought about what that might be. The library had become Hermione Granger's preferred place to exist. This was not, she knew, how most students felt about it. The first years who drifted in during the second week of term tended to look faintly alarmed, as though the books might require something of them. But Hermione had grown up in a house with 2 dentists who read constantly and believed in the improvement of the mind as something close to a duty, and she felt more at home among the shelves than she had in any of the classrooms, even the ones she was excelling in, which was most of them. She had turned 12 on the 19th of September, quietly, without making an occasion of it. Nobody had known to make an occasion of it. She had spent the birthday evening in the library, which felt right. 3 weeks into term, lessons had settled into patterns. She was doing well in all of them: transfiguration, charms, herbology, history of magic, astronomy, defense against the dark arts. The exception was potions, which was taught by Professor Snape, and which she had found was less about the subject than about the subject of Snape watching the students who interested him. He had sallow skin, dark eyes, and black hair that hung in heavy curtains alongside his face, and he had taken an early and conspicuous interest in Harry Potter's academic performance, an interest that had, from the very first lesson, looked less like teaching than it did like testing something he had already decided the outcome of. He had asked Harry questions he had no reasonable way of knowing the answers to, in a voice barely above a murmur. He had noted each failure with a patience that suggested satisfaction. Hermione did not understand it. Not understanding things made her want to research them. The Morgan Le Fay card was propped against a stack of books on the table in front of her. She had been looking at it for weeks, not constantly, but returning to it. Dark hair, dark eyes, an expression that suggested the painter had not been entirely comfortable during the sitting. Dark witch, once ruler of the island of Avalon. She had found Avalon in a general history text on the 3rd shelf from the left. A real island, somewhere in the British Isles, sealed since the end of the Arthurian Age by Morgan Le Fay herself. 2 sentences. No location given. No description of what the sealing meant or what lay behind it. 2 sentences were not enough. 2 sentences were the beginning of a question. She was still reading when Harry Potter came in. She registered him mainly because he sat down at her table, the only one with room, and set down a herbology textbook with the particular care of someone not looking forward to opening it. He sat across from her without acknowledging anything, opened the textbook, frowned at it for approximately 10 seconds, and closed it again. Then he looked at the card. "Isn't that from the Chocolate Frog?" he said. "Yes." "Morgan Le Fay." He read the name. "I don't actually know who she is." Hermione hesitated. She was not entirely certain how to explain what she had been doing for 2 weeks without it sounding obsessive. "She ruled an island called Avalon," she said, "in the wizarding world during the Arthurian period. The island is real, somewhere off the British coast, but it's been sealed since her rule ended. There's almost nothing written about it. I've been trying to find more." Harry was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the card with an expression she had noticed on him before, but hadn't had a name for. Something turned inward, not quite reaching his face. "The hat said something to me," he said, after it decided on Gryffindor. It said, he paused. "It said there was more to me than a scar and a prophecy, that the oldest of lines stirs when it touches me." He glanced up. "I've been carrying that around for 3 weeks, and I still don't know what it means." Hermione set down her quill. "It said something to me too," she said. She told him. She had not said it out loud before, and saying it felt different from the way she had turned it over silently. The words had a weight to them she had almost managed to talk herself into dismissing. Muggle-born, you say? The blood says otherwise, further back than your family's memory reaches. A squib's line carries more than it knows. Harry stared at her. So it said something to both of us, he said. About lines. Yes. Ron Weasley appeared at the end of the nearest shelf. He had followed Harry in and spent the last few minutes pretending to look for something, and had apparently decided to stop pretending. He sat down. What did I miss? Harry told him. Ron listened well when he wasn't talking, which was something Harry had noticed. He turned a chess piece over in his hands, a white knight with a chip in its base that he'd been carrying since the start of term. And when Harry finished, he said, Merlin was Slytherin. Everyone's heard of Merlin. We know, Hermione said. I'm just saying, if Harry's descended from some line connected to Merlin, and Merlin was Slytherin. Ron looked at Harry. Why are you in Gryffindor? Because I asked not to be in Slytherin. Right, but Merlin's house isn't the same as Merlin's legacy, Hermione said. She had been thinking about this. She had been thinking about very little else since she found those 2 sentences. He was Slytherin by sorting, but he spent his entire life using that power to protect Muggles. He founded the Order of Merlin specifically for it, to create laws for their benefit. His house was Slytherin. His work was... She gestured toward herself, which felt like the clearest argument available. For people like me. Ron considered this. He seemed to find it either interesting or difficult to argue with. All right, he said. So what does the oldest of lines actually mean? Nobody had an answer. From the corridor outside the library's tall windows, a figure paused. Dumbledore had not planned to pass this way at this hour, but he had, and through the glass he could see 3 first-years at a table with a chocolate frog card, and the careful faces of people who had just told each other something they had each been carrying alone. Potter, Granger, Weasley. He could not hear what they were saying. He didn't need to. He had expected this eventually. He had not expected it to happen in the 3rd week of September. He walked on. He needed to think carefully before he acted. He was beginning to understand, thought carefully enough. Hermione proposed they research it properly. She was very clear about this. The oldest of lines, she said, tapping her quill against the table. A squib's line. Those are 2 different phrasings of something that has a specific name we haven't found yet. The hat described it as though it were a known thing, as though we should have recognized it. She looked at Harry. When it said, this thread, does that sound like something with an actual name? Something with a history? It talked like it expected me to know what it meant, Harry said. I didn't. Then we need to find it. She began sorting the books in front of her into a different order. There has to be more than 2 sentences somewhere in this library. Ron looked at this with the resignation that Hermione had observed was his default expression when she announced projects. He was a fast learner in some respects. Fine, he said. But when we find out what it is, he pointed the chess piece at Harry, I'm telling Fred and George. Harry said that seemed fair. October had settled over Hogwarts in the way it always did. First the cold, then the particular smell of wet stone that rose from the grounds whenever a door opened, then the evenings drawing in until dinner felt like it happened at night. It had been 6 weeks since the sorting. Harry, Ron, and Hermione had been in the library every Tuesday and Thursday for the last 4 of them. They had developed a routine. Hermione arrived first, located what she needed, and had it open on the table by the time Harry and Ron appeared. Ron had a quill set in front of him before he could object. The precedent had established itself within the first 2 sessions. Hermione had found the relevant section in the 3rd week, read everything in it over 2 visits, and pronounced it insufficient. She had widened the search. The history shelves had yielded 1 useful volume, which she had been reading aloud in installments ever since, with the delivery of someone who had decided the others were going to learn whether they chose to or not. "Merlin," she said, opening the book to a chapter marked with 4 bookmarks. "The Prince of Enchanters. He attended Hogwarts when it was founded, around 990 AD, and was sorted into Slytherin." She looked at Ron. "Which we already knew." "Just making sure we're all clear," Ron said. "He was a charms specialist. He served in King Arthur's court. He founded the Order of Merlin." She turned a page. "The Order of Merlin First Class ribbon is green, his house color. Everything in his legacy points back to Slytherin, and everything in his life's work pointed somewhere else entirely." "He protected Muggles," Harry said. "Slytherin hated Muggles." "That's the contradiction," Hermione said. "I think that's what the hat was trying to say." Ron had written Prince of Enchanters and underlined it twice. "Merlin got sorted into the house that hated Muggles and spent his whole life protecting them. That must have been uncomfortable." "He left everything to what came after him," Hermione said, half to herself. "The order, the laws, the protection. Everything he built was designed to last. The question is what else he left." Harry had no answer yet, but he was beginning to think they were reading the right book. "Hagrid told me about Voldemort," Harry said. "The name did what it always did." Ron stopped fidgeting and looked at the table. "He said Voldemort was the heir of Slytherin, descended from Slytherin himself. Does that mean Voldemort and Merlin are related? If Merlin's connected to Slytherin's line, they're not related," Hermione said, already turning to a different page. "The book is specific. Merlin's connection to the Slytherin line is house membership, not blood. Slytherin was a founder. Merlin was a student. There's no documented family relationship between them." She closed the book. "They both drew from the same source of power. They went in entirely opposite directions with it." "One protected Muggles," Ron said. "One tried to exterminate them." "The house was never the point," Hermione said. She had been saying it to herself for weeks, by the sound of it. "That's what the hat knew when it placed both of us where it did." Severus Snape had not acquired the habit of noticing what first years read in the library. It was not, as a general matter, relevant. He had returned a confiscated text to the restricted section, taken from a 3rd year who had been using it for purposes other than its intended study. And he would not ordinarily have registered the occupants of the tables as he passed, but the history volume was open to a specific page, and the chapter heading was legible from 10 feet away. He walked past without pausing. Potter looked up and then looked away, which was what Potter did when he encountered something he found intimidating, which was most things. Granger did not look up. He was aware of which chapter it was. He returned the confiscated book to its shelf and left. Later, in his quarters with the evening settled in around him, he stood at the window with a glass he was not particularly tasting. Merlin was Slytherin. This was not a complicated fact. It was one of the first things any student of magical history learned. The most celebrated wizard in the world had come from the house that still bore the harshest reputation in the school. That he had turned that inheritance toward the protection of Muggles was acknowledged in footnotes, and then, as a rule, passed over. The Order of Merlin ribbon was green. That was the fact everyone remembered. Merlin was not a comfortable subject for anyone who thought seriously about what Slytherin's legacy actually required of its students. Severus had spent 20 years in this school, and had never quite managed to pass over it. Whatever Potter was reading was none of his business. Potter was 11. He was reading library books. There was no reason for concern. The chapter heading had been The Prince of Enchanters. And Potter had been reading it the way people read things they expect to mean something specific. He set down the glass. He needed to speak to Dumbledore. He needed, first, to decide what he was going to say. The following Thursday, Ron arrived with a chocolate frog card, held up between two fingers before anyone could speak. "Found one," he said, sliding it across the table. Harry took it. The illustration moved. Merlin inclined his head with the slight acknowledgement of someone accustomed to being studied. The caption read, "Merlin, the Prince of Enchanters, one of the most famous wizards of all time, founder of the Order of Merlin, served in the court of King Arthur of Britain." "We have the book," Hermione said. "The book doesn't have a picture," Ron said. "Also, I found it." Harry was reading the card again. The Prince of Enchanters. He had read the phrase in the history text 3 times, and it kept snagging at something, the way a word did when you couldn't place where you'd heard it before, when you were certain it connected to something else you were already looking for. Prince. Prince's line. The hat had said the oldest of lines. But what if the oldest had a name? What if the line was the prince's? "The prince's line," he said. He hadn't meant to say it out loud. Hermione's quill stopped. "Say that again," she said. "The card says Prince of Enchanters," Harry said. "The hat talked about the oldest of lines. A thread, it called it. What if this is it? What if the line has a name? The prince's line?" Hermione did not say he was right. She did not say he was wrong. She pulled the history volume toward her and opened it to a page she had marked, reading with her lips pressed together in the way she read when she was checking rather than learning. Ron looked at Harry. Harry looked at Ron. "Does that mean you're right?" Ron said. "I genuinely don't know," Harry said. The owl arrived at dinner on a Friday, landing in front of Harry first, and then turning and waiting, with the particular patience of an animal that had been given specific instructions until Hermione acknowledged it. 2 letters, identical parchment, identical hand. Albus Dumbledore requested the pleasure of their company at 4 o'clock on Tuesday. He hoped their studies were proceeding satisfactorily. Nothing in the letter indicated that it had come from a man who had been watching them through library windows for the better part of a month. Harry read his letter twice. Hermione read hers once, folded it, and placed it in her robe pocket in the way she placed things that were going to require preparation. Ron sat across from them and said nothing for a measured interval. "So," he said. "He knows. He's always known," Hermione said. "He was watching us in the library." She looked at Harry. He was waiting for us to find enough that he'd have to say something. The owl departed without waiting for a response. The gargoyle at the foot of the staircase stepped aside when Hermione recited the password Dumbledore's letter had included in a careful postscript. Acid pops, with the impassive efficiency of something that had been performing this function for a very long time, and had no opinion about it. The staircase beyond was moving, which Harry had not expected, and then there was a landing and a door, and then they were inside. The office was circular, its walls rising to a curved ceiling that caught the October afternoon through tall windows. Portraits lined the walls, painted men and women of varying ages and eras, a few awake and watching, most apparently asleep. One of them opened one eye as Harry came in, seemed to recognize something in his face, and closed it again with the air of deliberate neutrality. Dumbledore was behind his desk. Professor McGonagall stood beside it with her hands folded, her square spectacles catching the light. She had the expression she reserved for situations that were technically within the rules and emotionally problematic. "Sit down," Dumbledore said. "Please." They sat. "I received your owl," Hermione said, "immediately." "You did," Dumbledore agreed, with the equanimity of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by accurate statements. He looked at Harry, then at Hermione, then at Harry again, and folded his hands on the desk in front of him. His half-moon spectacles had slid slightly toward the end of his nose. He did not adjust them. "I would like to hear, in your own words, what the Sorting Hat said to you when it placed you in Gryffindor. Both of you, separately." Harry went first. He said the words as he remembered them, which was exactly because he had turned them over in his head often enough that they had worn grooves. "There is more to you than a scar and a prophecy, boy. The oldest of lines stirs when I touch you. Slytherin once carried this thread. Now you carry it in Gryffindor cloth." McGonagall's expression didn't shift. Her eyes moved to Dumbledore. Hermione recited hers. "Muggle-born, you say? The blood says otherwise, further back than your family's memory reaches. A squib's line carries more than it knows." "Gryffindor." The room was very quiet. One of the portraits coughed diplomatically and went back to sleep. "Yes," Dumbledore said. It was not an answer to anything specific. "That is consistent with what the hat reported to me." "It reports to you," Harry said. "After each sorting, yes. A notation, no more than a line. In over 1,000 years of sortings, I have seen one other notation of this kind. In a record. Not in a living student." Hermione was still in the way she got when she was working through something before she was ready to speak it. "What does it mean?" "It means the hat recognized something it has encountered before, and not recently." Dumbledore sat back. "I will tell you what I believe to be true. I will be honest about what I don't yet know." He let that stand for a moment before continuing. "Merlin was the most famous wizard who ever lived, unquestionably. He attended this school when the school was still very new, and was sorted into Slytherin. He was a charm specialist who became rather more than that. An advisor to King Arthur's court, the founder of the Order of Merlin, and a man who believed that the most powerful wizards bore the greatest obligations to those with no power at all." He paused. He also spent a considerable portion of his life in direct opposition to a sorceress named Morgan Le Fay. "Who ruled Avalon?" Hermione said. Dumbledore looked at her for slightly longer than was strictly required. "Who ruled Avalon?" he agreed. "You've been in the library." "For 6 weeks, Harry said. "Good." He meant it plainly. "Then you understand something of what the hat was likely registering. Merlin was not merely a notable figure. He was a progenitor of a line, a tradition, and a claim that outlasted him by a great deal. The Sorting Hat has access to over 1,000 years of institutional memory. When it encounters something it has catalogued before, even in dormant form, it recognizes it." He looked at Harry, then at Hermione. "I believe it recognized that in both of you." "Our line," Hermione said. "I believe so. The distinction between I believe and it was careful and deliberate. I can't tell you with certainty what carrying such a line will mean. I'm not entirely certain myself. What I can tell you is that you are not imagining it. The hat made no error. There is a reason it spoke to you. And this is," he chose the word slowly, "the first time in all my years that I have seen it alive." Hermione was quiet for 3 seconds. Harry counted. McGonagall had still not moved. Dumbledore opened the top drawer of his desk and removed a folded piece of parchment. He uncapped a quill and wrote on it as he spoke. "I have signed a pass for the restricted section, for one book specifically." He said the title as he wrote it, A History of Ancient Bloodlines. Left wall near the back, the medieval registry records. You'll find what you need in there. He folded the pass and held it towards them. Hermione took it. Read what pertains to entries you find relevant, he said. I'm not going to tell you what to look for. He recapped the quill. I think it will be more useful to you if you find it yourselves. What if we don't recognize what's relevant? Harry said. Dumbledore looked at him, then at Hermione, and his expression held something that was neither approval nor amusement, but occupied the same region. I suspect you will. They left. As the gargoyle fell back into place behind them, Harry had the distinct feeling that the office had known considerably more than it had offered, and was not sorry about the difference. The door had been shut for perhaps 20 seconds when McGonagall spoke. Albus. Her voice in private had a different quality than in the classroom, the same precision, a different weight behind it. What do you know that you haven't told them? Dumbledore remained in his chair. He looked at his hands. There is a record, Minerva, he said, a registry from the 13th century. I have believed for 50 years that the line had gone entirely extinct. It appears I was wrong. She was quiet for a moment. Both of them? Both of them. He folded his hands on the desk. I did not expect both. In all the years I watched for any indication, in all the years I concluded it must have died out, passed beyond what I could trace. I never once imagined it would surface in 2 students, in the same house, in the same year. What does that mean for them? He looked up. That they will need to find out what it means. I can't do that part for them. That is, I think, rather the point. You might at least have told them about the record. What would I have told them? That for half a century I believed I was looking for something extinct. They are 11 and 12 years old, Minerva. What they need now is a book and a direction. What they will need later is something I hope very much they find themselves. Because the alternative— He stopped. He picked up his quill and set it down again. The alternative is that I give them conclusions I'm not certain of, and they build on a foundation I haven't verified. McGonagall looked at him for a moment longer than was comfortable. She did not press it. The door opened without a knock. Snape stood in the frame. He had, apparently, been in the corridor. He stepped inside without invitation, not with the confidence of someone who belonged, but with the efficiency of someone who had decided belonging was beside the point. I watched them leave, he said, which was a statement of what had been arranged, not an explanation for it. His dark eyes moved across the room. McGonagall, the desk, Dumbledore, with the particular economy of someone who had come for one thing and intended to get it. Merlin was Slytherin, Albus. Is it possible that the bloodline claim is being manufactured to give Potter a second identity beyond the prophecy? The room was quiet in the way rooms became quiet when a question had been asked that would not be unsaid. I don't manufacture identities, Severus, Dumbledore said, with the calm of a man who had been asked harder things. I only fail to extinguish them quickly enough. Something shifted in Snape's expression. Not the ordinary reorganization of contempt. Something passed that, to a register he kept largely unused, and clearly preferred that way. He held Dumbledore's gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he left. The door closed behind him, quietly. McGonagall looked at Dumbledore. That, she said, was not a question about Potter. No, Dumbledore said. It wasn't. He returned to his notes. The portraits on the walls remained, as they generally did, more attentive to the silences between conversations than to the conversations themselves. The invisibility cloak had arrived on Christmas morning without a note. or almost without one. There had been a single slip of parchment that said, "Your father left this in my possession before he died. It is time it was returned to you. Use it well." Harry had sat on the dormitory floor with the cloak in his hands and thought it was the strangest gift he had ever received, not because it was magic, but because it was his father's, and that word had always meant one thing until now. He mentioned it to Hermione in January, after the holidays. She had said, "Dumbledore's pass is still valid. The restricted section doesn't close at night, it locks, but if you have an authorized pass and a cloak, those are two separate problems solved." Ron was not on the pass. He had pointed this out, settled back with his chessboard, and allowed himself to be interpreted as assent. They had left him in the common room at 11:15. The restricted section at night had its own atmosphere. The smell was the same as the general library, old parchment and accumulated knowledge that hadn't been accessed in a while, but thicker, and the shelves pressed closer. Some of the books chained to their shelves had covers that seemed to absorb light. None of them moved, which Harry found more unsettling than if they had. He found the volume on the third shelf from the left, near the back, almost at the end of the row. A History of Ancient Bloodlines, Volume 1, in dark green binding with faded gold stamping. He opened it on the floor between them. The cloak pooled around their shoulders, barely wide enough for two. Hermione angled the small lamp they'd brought, so the light fell on the pages without escaping the edges of the cloak. The first sections covered the great wizarding families of medieval Britain in alphabetical order. Family names Harry didn't recognize, lineages that crossed and recrossed through the centuries like roads on a map he had no scale for. He read through them with methodical attention until he reached the P section and found the name. Peveril family, a medieval pure-blood wizarding family, famed for being the original masters of the Deathly Hallows. He stopped. "What are the Deathly Hallows?" he said quietly. Hermione was already reading past his shoulder. "I don't know either," she said. "Keep going." 3 brothers, Antioch, Cadmus, and Ignotus. The entry spent most of its space on the legend of 3 objects of extraordinary magical power, their origins disputed, their subsequent histories imperfectly tracked. Harry read through it looking for something specific, and found it in the final paragraph. Ignotus Peveril, youngest and wisest of the 3, born 12th July 1214 and died 19th of May 1292. He is believed to have passed his artifact and his lineage to his descendants without incident. Several notable wizarding families trace their ancestry to Ignotus Peveril, including the Potter family of the West Country. Harry read it twice. "That's me," he said. His own voice sounded strange in the dark. "There's a cross-reference," Hermione said. "At the bottom?" There was, in small print. See also, Prince's Line, Volume 2. Volume 2 was on the same shelf, slightly to the left, thinner, its spine less worn. Harry pulled it out. The index listed one chapter under P, the Prince's Line. Collateral Descendants of the Enchanter. The chapter had been added to the volume in a slightly different hand from the rest of the text, as though it had been inserted later, and the printer had not been informed. The text was written in the declarative register of 13th century scholarly record, precise, impersonal, and entirely confident that these facts required no argument. Merlin, styled the Prince of Enchanters, left no known direct descendants. His line did not transmit as standard lineages did. The specific quality the author described, the enchanter's particular inheritance, moved instead through collateral kin, families connected to Merlin's bloodline by marriage or by common ancestry, rather than by direct parent-to-child descent. Where it settled quietly, a blood marker in registry records, unremarked in most generations. In the mid-13th century, this collateral thread intersected with the Peveril family. Ignotus Peveril, 1214–1292, was identified in contemporary registry documents as the earliest known carrier of the prince's line blood marker in the active wizarding record. The line had not, as best the author could determine, died with him. Harry sat back on his heels and held the open book. He descended from Ignotus Peveril through the Potter family. Ignotus Peveril was the earliest known carrier of the prince's line. The Potter family traced to Ignotus Peveril. He had a scar. He had a prophecy. He had a dead father's cloak. He had the oldest line in Britain, apparently threaded through his ancestry without anyone having told him. "Hermione," he said. "I'm already looking," she said. She had moved 6 feet down the aisle. She had gone directly to the G section, with the focus she brought to everything she was not entirely calm about. Harry came to stand beside her. The Granger entry was not a family record in the way the Peveril entry had been. No house, no coat of arms, no cross-referenced marriages and descendants. Just a single line in what appeared to be an individual registry, names added in a clerical hand, annotated and dated. Eleanor Granger, Squib, B.D. 1742, D. 1801. Last carrier of Prince Line blood marker, recorded in active magical registry. Line presumed extinct. Removed 1801. Hermione read it twice. She stood very still. Line presumed extinct. Removed 1801. She had been born in 1979. If the registry had crossed the line out in 1801, it had been absent from the record for 178 years before she arrived in this library to find it. It hadn't died. It had passed through Eleanor Granger's children and their children, through daughters and granddaughters who had no magic at all, who had grown up in Muggle England in the 19th and 20th centuries, not knowing their ancestors' registry entry had been removed by a clerk who could not see where the line had gone, until one of those descendants became a dentist and had a daughter who turned out to be a witch, and that witch had been sorted into Gryffindor on the 1st of September, and had not yet understood all the ways in which she had been carrying something she didn't know about. "My whole family," Hermione said. She wasn't speaking to Harry specifically. "For nearly 200 years. Harry said nothing. He understood, in a different way, about carrying things without being told. They sat on the floor of the restricted section under the cloak, the 2 volumes on the stone between them, the library dark and still in every direction. One of the chained books shifted on its shelf nearby. Neither of them looked at it. Hermione thought out loud when something was too large to process silently and too unresolved to state as fact. She said, being Muggle-born was not a qualification she needed explained away. Her parents were the people who had taught her to read, who had packed her trunk for a school neither of them could attend. The Muggle-born part of who she was. That wasn't a problem. That was the thing she was most certain of. And now her Muggle family had been quietly carrying one of the oldest magical bloodlines in Britain for nearly 2 centuries without knowing. "It doesn't change what I am," she said, working through it, her voice careful and even. Eleanor Granger was a squib. The line passed through Muggle hands. Merlin spent his entire life using his power to protect Muggles. The Order of Merlin, the laws, all of it. She was quiet for a moment. "It fits. I just didn't expect it to be quite so old." Harry was looking at the pages. He had a medieval line, and a prophecy, and a scar, and a father's cloak, and the name of an ancestor born 800 years ago, who had apparently decided, through some mechanism of collateral inheritance, that Harry was a suitable carrier of the oldest blood in Britain. "How much can one person be?" he said. Hermione was quiet for a moment. "I think that's rather the point," she said. "Merlin wasn't supposed to be one person either." After that, neither of them spoke for a while. The library held the silence in the way it did, not emptily, but with the particular density of a place that had absorbed a great many things and kept them. Harry closed Volume 2, then Volume 1. "We should go back," Hermione said. "Yes," Harry said. Neither of them moved immediately. The floor was cold stone, and the cloak was warm, and they were in the only place in the school where they knew, with documented certainty, exactly what they were. February arrived over Hogwarts with the quality of winter that had lasted long enough to stop being seasonal and become simply the condition of things. The snow had compacted to grey-white along the stone windowsills. The grounds had the particular look of a place waiting for something different to happen to it. Inside, the castle ran warm, fires in every grate, portraits drifting between frames in search of conversation. But there was a stillness to the air that Harry had been noticing for the last several weeks. Something was holding its breath. Defense Against the Dark Arts met on Tuesday mornings in a classroom on the 3rd floor. Quirrell arrived, as he generally did, with the appearance of a man for whom arriving anywhere required more effort than should have been necessary. His purple turban slightly askew, his robes gathered around him with the vague untidiness of someone who had more important concerns than presentation. He set his notes on the desk, straightened them, moved them slightly to the left, and then appeared to forget they existed. Today, he said, addressing the room with the stammer that the first years had grown accustomed to treating as a rhythmic interruption in his sentences. "We will be looking at theoretical protections against dark enchantments, specifically the category of seals." He turned to write on the board. "Magical seals, how they are constructed, what they require to be maintained." He wrote the word "sealed" in careful letters and underlined it twice. Hermione, beside Harry, wrote it down. Harry watched her write it and thought about the fact that she had read 2 chapters on sealing enchantments in the restricted section 3 weeks ago. He thought about the book that had described Avalon's sealed state. The island Morgan Le Fay had locked at the end of her rule, that had stayed locked for centuries because no one alive could open it. He thought about the fact that Quirrell's gaze, when he turned from the board, swept the room and settled, just for a moment, in the direction of the 2nd row. He thought about it for the rest of the lesson. Quirrell discussed the mechanics of sealing, the difference between passive seals, set and maintained by an enchantment that required no living will to sustain them, and active seals which were bound to a bloodline and could only be broken by that same line. He discussed what happened when the source of a seal died before a successor appeared. He used examples from the 17th century, names of dark witches and wizards Harry had never heard of, the careful academic vocabulary of someone who had read extensively about something they didn't want to appear to care about. Hermione asked 2 questions. Both received answers that were technically accurate and somehow told her nothing she didn't already know. Harry noticed that Quirrell answered her with his eyes on her face in a way that felt less like attention than like measurement. When the class ended, the room emptied in the usual rush. Harry stayed to repack his bag. A strap had come loose at the buckle, and Hermione waited. Quirrell remained at the front, shuffling papers he had already shuffled. As they reached the corridor, Hermione glanced at Harry. He glanced back. Neither said anything. Neither needed to. Behind them, alone in the classroom, Quirrell stood very still. The voice at the back of his skull was very quiet, the way it was when it was being careful rather than urgent, when it was thinking rather than directing. They know the prince's line. They're reading the sealed registers. The last time anyone carried that blood, They died before they could claim what they sought. Quirrell kept his eyes on the papers in front of him. He made no sign that he was listening. He had learned, in the months since October, when to let the voice speak without answering. The corridor outside was empty. He set down the papers. That evening, in his office, a room he had arranged to look like a place where a young man taught defense against the dark arts and worried ordinarily about grades and lesson plans, he sat at his desk with the door locked and the window covered and said to the air, "You recognized them today." The response came from somewhere at the back of his skull, which was where it resided when it chose not to make itself visible. "The stone is not all we came for." Quirrell said nothing. He had found, in the months of this arrangement, that silence was often the most useful response. "If those children reach Avalon before I have a body..." The voice paused in the way. It paused when it was choosing words with precision rather than haste. "The island's protections are ancient. Merlin's design. If his heirs claim the seal, the power held there becomes a force that could stand against me, and would stand for a very long time. The stone remains the priority. Yes." Something shifted in the quality of the silence, the way it shifted when a calculation had been completed and a new one begun. But the timeline has changed. Quirrell stared at the desk. In the window's reflection, his own face looked back at him, and above the collar of his robes, the edge of the turban where it was wrapped tight. He had been watching the first years in Quirrell's class for the past 6 weeks, not obviously, but Snape had been watching for a long time and had learned what obviously looked like. Quirrell's attention to Potter and Granger was not random and was not pedagogical. It had the specific quality of observation, careful, patient, collecting information rather than conveying it. Snape had been monitoring the third-floor corridor and the access points to the trap-door since September, which was when he had first noticed that Quirrell's behavior in the castle did not match the behavior of a nervous young teacher who was bad at his job. Quirrell watched the school the way someone watched a building they were planning to enter. He watched Potter the way someone watched a problem, and for the last 6 weeks he had been watching Granger with the same attention, the same quality of assessment that he gave the corridors. On a Wednesday evening in the second week of February, Snape arrived in Dumbledore's office. "Quirrell is not teaching Data," he said. "He is studying them." Dumbledore set down his quill. "You're certain?" "I am certain he chose today's lesson topic deliberately. I am certain he kept them after class under the pretense of reviewing notes he had already reviewed. I am certain that for 6 weeks he has been watching exactly 2 students with a consistency that has nothing to do with their academic performance." A pause. "I am certain of who is directing him." Dumbledore looked at his desk for a moment. "Thank you, Severus." Snape did not stay. 2 days later, Dumbledore's owl arrived at breakfast, carrying 2 identical letters. He would like to see Harry and Hermione that afternoon, 4 o'clock if they could manage it. They could manage it. Dumbledore, when they arrived, poured them each a small glass of something warm and honey-sweet without asking. He waited until they had drunk some of it before speaking. "I have strengthened the enchantments on certain parts of the castle," he said. "You need not know which parts. What I want to tell you is this." He set his own glass down. "If a teacher ever makes you uncomfortable, if something about the way they speak to you, or watch you, or arrange a lesson seems intended for your benefit specifically, rather than the class's, trust that instinct. It is generally a reliable one." Harry said, "Is this about Professor Quirrell?" "It is about all your teachers," Dumbledore said. "It is useful guidance regardless of context." He said it with the mild precision of a man who was not lying and was not quite answering, and who understood the distinction clearly. Hermione wrote nothing in her notes during the meeting. Afterward, she opened her notebook to a fresh page and wrote 4 words. Trust the instinct. She underlined it once, considered, and underlined it again. The library in late February had a different quality from the library in October. The grey light through the high windows was thinner, more wintry, and the afternoon sessions had a compressed feeling, as though the light was always on the edge of running out before they were finished. They had been meeting 3 times a week since January. The table at the back, left under the window with the view of the frozen grounds, had become theirs by occupation, if not designation. The research had a different quality now, too. In October, they had been looking for a name. In November and December, they had been reading history. In January, they had found the Bloodlines volumes and the entries that confirmed everything. Now, in late February, they were sitting with the weight of confirmed facts and trying to decide what came next. Hermione had been working through secondary texts on Arthurian period magical geography. Ron, who was not researching but was present, was fighting a potions essay, line by line. Harry was holding a book open and not reading it. The lesson from Tuesday was still doing something uncomfortable in the back of his mind. The way Quirrell had looked at them, the way the topic had been seals. He had been turning it over for 3 days and had not finished. The book fell from the shelf beside the window without anyone touching it, not toppled by a neighboring book shifting against it. It came straight off the row, as though something had called it, and struck the floor with the specific thud of a thick volume hitting stone. The sound was loud enough in the quiet library that Ron's head came up, quill still in hand. None of them were near it. The shelf was 6 feet to Harry's left, and they had been at the table for 2 hours. Hermione was out of her chair before Harry was. She knelt beside the book and looked at the open pages without touching them. The considered caution of someone who had spent enough time around magical objects to approach unexpected ones carefully. "Come and look at this," she said. The book was thick and old, its spine cracked along the base from long disuse. The pages it had opened to were near the middle of the volume, and what they showed was not text. It was a map, hand-drawn, in ink that had faded to the color of dried rust, on a sheet of vellum pasted into the book at a different time from the original binding. The cartography was fine and meticulous, coastlines carefully rendered, river mouths indicated, islands scattered across what Harry recognized as the sea off the western coast of Britain. Each island was marked with a small annotation in the same faded hand. The islands to the north and northwest had Gaelic names. Those to the southwest had names he didn't recognize. In the center of the map, slightly apart from the others, and drawn to a larger scale than surrounding features, one island had been outlined twice with a deliberate encircling hand, as though the cartographer had returned to it after finishing the rest. The ink of the double circle was slightly darker than the rest, as if it had been drawn with more care or more intention. Below the circle, a caption in the same reddish-brown ink. Hermione read it aloud. Innis Avalon, last sealed by Morgana Le Fay at the close of her rule, in the age of Arthur. Ron looked at the map. He looked at Harry. He looked at Hermione. "Right," he said. "I'm going to need someone to explain what's happening." Hermione found the lending record at the catalogue near the entrance, a narrow card kept in a paper sleeve inside the back cover, listing every student who had borrowed or requested the volume since it had been acquired. She turned to the first entry, then the second. She turned the card over. Both sides were blank. She brought it back to the table and set it between them. "It's never been checked out," she said. "No student has ever opened this book." She looked at the date printed on the card's header, the cataloguing year, in over 400 years. How does a book sit in a library for 400 years without anyone reading it? Ron said. People don't read every book, Hermione said, especially one shelved in the wrong section. She turned to the spine. The volume had been catalogued under Arthurian geographic studies, a category she had already checked that appeared in no Hogwarts student reading list in living memory. It's been here the whole time. No one looked. She set it down. She looked at it for a moment with an expression Harry had learned to read as something between excitement and the particular variety of unease that came from realizing the size of something. It was Harry who said they should take it directly to Dumbledore. Hermione looked at him. "Every time," Harry said, "Dumbledore tells us slightly more than he told us before. The hat, then the restricted section pass, then the advice about Quirrell. Each time something new happens, and he gives us the next piece. But he's never not known. He already had the book under his arm. He knew what we'd find in that Bloodlines volume before he let us find it. Whatever this map is, he already knows what it means." Hermione considered it. She could not, on reflection, argue with any of it. Ron stayed. "I'm not on the pass," he said, which carried a slightly different weight than it had in January, and which Harry took as acknowledgement rather than complaint. Harry went up the staircases and down the 7th-floor corridor to the gargoyle and said the new password, Sherbet Lemon, without having been summoned. The gargoyle stepped aside. This was the first time Harry had done that. Dumbledore was at his desk. He looked up, registered Harry, registered what was under Harry's arm, and looked at Harry again. A pause. "Is Miss Granger with you?" "In the corridor." "Please ask her to come in." He studied the map without speaking for longer than was comfortable. Harry and Hermione stood on the other side of the desk and didn't fill the silence. One of the portraits cleared its throat softly and was not acknowledged. The afternoon light was going, the windows darkening at their edges. Dumbledore closed his eyes. Not in distress, more the way someone did when they needed a moment between what they were and what they were about to say. He opened them. "Sit down," he said. They sat. "Avalon is real." He said it plainly, as though he had been holding the sentence prepared and had decided this was the moment to release it. "I have known it exists for a great many years. This island," he touched the edge of the map without touching the drawn circle, "was sealed by Morgan Le Fay at the end of her rule. She placed a binding on it at the close of the age you see described here, and nothing has broken it since. The seal has held for 1,000 years, Hermione said, very quietly. "Merlin." "Merlin," Dumbledore agreed. "He designed the mechanism by which it could be undone, not the seal itself. That was Morgan Le Fay's work. But the condition of release. He built a safeguard into the island's binding. He was, among his many other qualities, an extraordinarily careful man." He folded his hands. "The seal requires two people of the right bloodline, arriving and claiming together. One is not enough. One heir, however genuine, however certain of their heritage, cannot break what Merlin placed." Harry looked at Hermione. She was looking at the desk. "He designed it for two," Dumbledore continued. "He knew, or foresaw, or intended, I cannot say which, that the line would divide. That if it survived at all, it would survive in separate branches that might not find each other for generations. The two-person requirement was a protection. It meant that no single claimant could take Avalon alone." He was quiet for a moment. "In all my years," and here he gestured slightly toward himself in acknowledgement of what years meant for someone of his age, "I have known of no living heir to that line. I believed, for 50 of those years, that it had gone entirely extinct." He looked at them both. Harry, then Hermione, then Harry again. It appears I was wrong. And I was wrong in the most improbable way I can imagine. Not one heir, but two in the same year, in the same house. The room held the silence. Below, faintly, the castle was going about its early evening. Harry said, "Does Voldemort know?" Dumbledore looked at him. His expression held its usual precision, the careful management of what it would and would not show, and gave nothing beyond that. He did not answer. The silence was 5 seconds. Hermione counted. It was the answer. The note arrived at dinner on a Thursday evening in March, delivered by a second year. Harry didn't recognize who said he'd been asked to pass it along. It was written in handwriting Harry recognized as Neville's, the distinctive loop of someone who had learned to hold a quill later than most. And it asked if Harry could come down to the corridor outside the potions storeroom after dinner. He'd made a mess of his Bezoar essay. He didn't know who else to ask. N. Harry told Hermione he'd be back, pushed his chair away from the table and went. The dungeons had a different quality from the rest of Hogwarts. Lower ceilings, less torchlight, cold that lived in the stone as something permanent rather than seasonal. Harry had walked this corridor before on the way to potions. He knew where the storeroom was. He knew where the side passages branched. He counted the torches as he passed them, an unconscious habit from his first week of term, and reached the junction where Neville's note said to meet. Neville was not there. What was there, standing in the wall where wall should have been? Between two sconces, Harry was certain had faced each other across unbroken stone the last time he walked this corridor, was a door. It was old in a way that the rest of Hogwarts was not. The castle was ancient, but purposeful. This was something older and more deliberate, something that had not been built as much as placed. The surface was not smooth. It was carved over every inch in layers, a field of serpentine shapes that wound through and around each other without beginning or end, and over them a pattern of interlaced knotwork, angular, precise, the kind that took decisions at every crossing. The carvings covered the door entirely and disappeared into the frame on both sides. Harry stood for a moment. Then he put his hand on it. The effect was immediate and internal. Not a sound, but a feeling. A hum that ran up his arm and settled in the bones of his chest. The door warmed under his palm. Several of the carved symbols brightened one after another, following some sequence in the knotwork that Harry couldn't trace. The whole surface became briefly, unmistakably aware. Then it stopped. The door did not open. He kept his hand there for another 10 seconds, then took it away. The carvings had gone dark. The warmth in the stone remained, the only warm thing in the corridor, as though something on the other side was holding it. He went to find Hermione. She was at the back left table with 3 books open and a 4th in her hand, which was how Harry had left her. Ron was across from her with his potions essay, which had progressed either forward or backward since Tuesday. It was difficult to tell from the doorway. Harry sat down without a greeting and began to speak. He told them quickly. The note, the corridor, no Neville, the door, what it had done when he touched it, and what it had not done. He was watching Hermione while he spoke, the way he had learned to watch Hermione when he needed to know whether something was as significant as it felt, because her face generally gave him the answer before she did. Her face told him. "What is that face?" Ron said. He was looking between them with the expression of someone who had missed something obvious and intended to understand it. Hermione was already reaching for her cloak. They left Ron in the library. He had, Harry noticed, stopped objecting after the first sentence of explanation. He set his essay aside and said, with the air of someone arranging their business before a known development, "I'll be here if you need Dumbledore." The door was still there. Harry had not been certain it would be. He had half expected to arrive and find ordinary dungeon wall and have to stand there describing something to Hermione that she would believe, but would also look for an alternative explanation for. Instead, the door was present and unchanged, the knotwork flat and dim, the serpentine carvings quiet, the frame exactly as he had left it. Hermione walked forward without hesitating. She moved along the door's width slowly, studying the carvings at eye level, the way she read something she hadn't decided the meaning of yet. Harry watched her stop at one section of the knotwork and lean closer. "Medieval charms notation," she said, to herself and to Harry at once. "This is a conditional encoding. Every crossing in this knotwork is a decision, a requirement. It's not ornamentation." She traced one section of the pattern without touching it. "It's a lock written in old charms language, written by someone who understood exactly what they were doing. Can you read it?" "Not all of it. Enough." She looked at Harry. "Put your hand on it." He placed his palm against the center of the door. The hum returned immediately. Deeper this time, or fuller, as though the door had been holding the recognition and had only been waiting to continue it. The carvings brightened in the same sequence as before. Hermione put her hand alongside his. The door opened. It opened onto nothing that could have been behind a dungeon wall. For 10 seconds, Harry would count them later, trying to find the edges of the experience, and 10 was always where his counting ended. What was beyond the door was entirely present, entirely real, and entirely elsewhere. A sky, grey-white and low, the grey of winter over open water, with clouds moving fast across it. Under the sky, an island, dark rock and short grass, and the kind of flat, unrelenting wind that bent every living thing growing on it toward the east. At the island's centre, up a short rise, a hall built from the same dark stone as the rock around it, not constructed exactly, but emerged from the ground, as if the stone had always contained this shape and had simply expressed it. The walls were massive. No windows. Inside the hall, Harry could see it through no open door that should have given him the angle. 2 chairs, not made from wood or metal, carved from the same dark stone as the floor and the walls and the island itself, rough and unfinished and permanent, as though the rock had grown this way rather than been worked. Set facing each other, slightly apart, at the end of a floor on which nothing had been placed for a very long time. Empty. Waiting. The vision closed. Not gradually. It ended the way sleep ends, with the full weight of wherever you actually are coming back at once. The dungeon corridor was around them, and the door shut itself with the finality of something that has shown you what it needed to show you, and has nothing more to say about it. The silence in the corridor was complete. Harry realized he had taken his hand off the door at some point, and did not remember doing it. "That was Avalon," Hermione said. Harry said, "How do you know?" She was quiet for a moment. When she answered, her voice was careful and entirely certain. "Because I've never seen anywhere that old that still felt like it was waiting for something." Harry looked at the closed door. The carvings were dark and still. The stone was cold again. He was not frightened. He looked at Hermione and could see that she was not frightened either. They had no precise word for what they were instead. But something had settled underneath the absence of fear, the way a question settles when it finds ground. Both of them were certain, for the first time, without qualification. From the far end of the corridor, in the dark beside the last turning before the stairs, a figure had been standing long enough to see all of it. Snape had followed the forged notes trail before Harry had finished reading the original. The monitoring charm on Quirrell's office correspondence had been active since January. He had intercepted the copy before dinner, understood what it was, and been in position 10 minutes before Harry arrived. He had watched Harry touch the door. He had watched the carvings light, and the door refuse to open. He had watched Harry leave and return with Granger. He had watched the door open. He had seen the vision. He had stood at the far end of the corridor and seen, through a door in a dungeon wall in a school he had attended since he was 11, an island under a winter sky, and 2 chairs of dark stone, empty and very old, and he had let himself see it without looking away. He turned and walked back up the corridor toward the stairs, and his pace, for a man who never ran, was fast. Snape had given Dumbledore the forged note, the physical one that Harry had been handed at dinner, not the intercepted draft from Quirrell's office correspondence, but the original, and had described the door in the economical terms of a man who had a great deal of practice reporting things he found difficult. The door was real. It had opened. The vision behind it was Avalon. He described it as he had seen it, from the far end of the corridor, in the same flat register. He had identified the originating charm as Quirrell's work. He had been in position in the dungeon before Harry arrived. Dumbledore had said very little during the account. He had looked at the forged note once and set it down. "Severus," he said, when Snape had finished. "How long has Quirrell been watching them?" "Since February," Snape said, "actively planning for at least 2 weeks before tonight's note." The monitoring charm on his correspondence showed drafts dated in late February. He paused. "The forgery is competent. Potter wouldn't have questioned it." Dumbledore folded the note once and set it on the corner of his desk. He did not look satisfied, which was the correct response. They heard footsteps on the staircase. Then a knock. Harry and Hermione stopped in the doorway when they saw Snape. Snape looked at Harry once. The look had resentment in it, as it nearly always did. Long practiced and entirely sincere. But there was something else in it tonight that Harry didn't have a word for. Not sympathy. Something older and more complicated, from a man who kept most of his complications private. Then Snape looked away. "Come in," Dumbledore said. "Close the door. Sit down." They sat. Snape remained standing by the window with his arms folded. "Tell me what you saw," Dumbledore said. Harry told him. He had already told it twice, to Ron in the library, quickly, and to Hermione in the corridor, and the telling was growing efficient. The forged note, the dungeons, no Neville, the door in the wall, the serpentine carvings, the hum and warmth when he placed his hand on it, and the fact that it didn't open. Going back with Hermione, her hand alongside his, the door opening onto the island. He described the vision as accurately as he could. The grey sky, the dark rock island, the hall built as though it had grown from the ground, the 2 chairs of rough, dark stone, empty and waiting, the door shutting behind them, the corridor coming back. When he finished, Hermione said, "It was Avalon, we're certain." Dumbledore looked at her, and then at Harry. "Yes," he said. "I believe it was." He was quiet for a moment, and Harry had the impression he was deciding something. Not whether to speak, but where to begin. He had known for decades, he said, that a bloodline record existed. The Sorting Hat's institutional memory had held a notation from the medieval period, a line it had placed in Slytherin centuries ago, and had not encountered since. He had believed for 50 years that the line was extinct. He had searched on 3 separate occasions and found nothing alive. When Harry arrived in September and the Hat's notation changed that, he had taken it for an anomaly. When Hermione's notation read identically, he had understood it for what it was. He had not known about the Peveril connection. That was their finding, in the restricted section in January. The collateral link between Merlin's line and the Peveril family, running through Ignotus Peveril, then through centuries of Potters, was not in any record he had been able to access. He was glad they found it. He had known about Eleanor Granger. He had found that registry entry 30 years ago. Squib, B, 1742. D, 1801. Last known carrier of the Prince line blood marker. Line presumed extinct. Removed from active record 1801. He had held on to it without knowing what to hold on to it for. He had no living Granger to connect it to until the 1st of September 1991. "You've been watching us the whole time," Harry said. It was not quite an accusation. "Watching," Dumbledore said, "not arranging. There is a difference that may not feel like one from where you are sitting, and I will not ask you to find it comfortable." He set his hands flat on the desk. "What I can tell you is what the door in the dungeon means." The seal on Avalon would break when both heirs travelled to the island and claimed it together. The vision was not the claiming. The door, Merlin's sentry in the castle, placed there to verify the bloodline before the journey, had shown them the destination. That was its purpose. The verification was complete. "There is someone else," Dumbledore said, "who knows what you found tonight, and he is in this school." The room was very quiet. One of the portraits, which had been listening with visible attention, looked away. "He has been in this school since September," Dumbledore said. "And unlike Merlin's door, his interest in you is not governed by a mechanism designed for your protection." Snape from the window said nothing. Harry looked at him once and looked away. Dumbledore picked up the forged note from the corner of the desk, looked at it for a moment, and set it down again. "Do not go near the third-floor corridor on the right-hand side," he said. He said it directly, without the careful ambiguity he usually carried. "I said something to this effect at the start of term feast. I am saying it to you now, by name, because you are the two people in this school most likely to go there. What is kept at the end of that corridor is protected. It is protected because someone else wants it very badly. And if you go looking for it, you will meet that person." He looked at both of them. "I am not asking you not to be brave. I am asking you not to be early." Harry said. "All right." Hermione said. "Yes." Neither of them meant it entirely. Dumbledore appeared to understand this. In his quarters, with the fire down to coals and the window dark, Quirrell sat very still. The ward he had placed on the section of dungeon wall in January, designed to register any sustained magical response in that corridor, had dissolved at 9:30. He had felt it go. The door had opened. He had not needed to be there to know it. The voice at the back of his skull had been quiet for the last hour, which was how it sounded when it was thinking rather than speaking. "We must have the stone," it said at last, "before they reach Avalon, or we will never have a body strong enough to stop them." Quirrell stared at the coals. "The stone first," he said. "The stone first." A pause. The quality of the silence that followed was the quality of something that had made a decision and would not revisit it. And quickly, Hermione lay in her dormitory bed with the curtains drawn and the dark complete and her roommates asleep, and thought about Eleanor Granger, born 1742, died 1801, a squib, born carrying a bloodline she would have had no name for, and equipped with no ability to use what she carried. The registry entry had been crossed off in 1801 with the words, "Line presumed extinct," removed, which Hermione had now thought about enough times to find it the saddest administrative notation she had encountered in all of the research. Presumed, as if the person who removed it had known they might be wrong. They had been wrong. Eleanor Granger had had children who were not magic. Those children had had children who were not magic. And the line had moved through Muggle hands, through daughters who grew up in Muggle England in the 19th and 20th centuries, with no framework for what they carried and no way of being told. Until it arrived, finally, in a Muggle woman who became a dentist and had one daughter who turned out to be a witch. Hermione thought about what Merlin had believed. She had the text nearly by heart now. That wizards had an obligation to those with no magic, that the most powerful had the greatest duty to those with no power at all, that this was the conviction that had built the Order of Merlin and governed every law he had left behind. He was sorted Slytherin, and spent his entire life working for people Slytherin himself had despised. She was sorted Gryffindor. She was Muggle-born by birth and Muggle-raised by everything that mattered. She had a dentist father and a dentist mother who had packed her trunk for a school they would never fully understand, and a bloodline that had moved through 200 years of ordinary Muggle life before arriving here. Merlin had built the Order of Merlin to protect people like her family. He had believed, in an age when most powerful wizards believed the opposite, that Muggles deserved the protection of those who had power they didn't. She was exactly what he would have wanted. She lay in the dark for a while longer, listening to the old sounds of the castle, and thought that the strangest thing about it was that this felt, in the end, not like a discovery, but like something she had already known. May had settled over Hogwarts with the particular density of a month that meant examinations and endings. The grass had come back on the grounds. The evenings lasted long enough that dinner felt early, and the library was full of fifth years with the faces of people who had been warned about something for years and had chosen to think about it later. First years were not exempt from the pressure. The first round of end-of-year examinations was coming, and the castle had taken on a particular quality of held breath, the same quality it had held since March, but now with a deadline attached. Harry had been trying to concentrate on transfiguration theory for 6 days, and had found it increasingly difficult to treat the subject as the most urgent thing in his life. Ron found Harry and Hermione at their table at the back, left on a Tuesday evening in early May, without his chessboard, which was unusual. He sat down and put nothing on the table, which was more unusual. "I heard Quirrell," he said, "in the corridor outside the armor gallery, tonight after dinner. He was alone, and I don't think he knew anyone was there." Hermione looked up from her book. "He was talking about timing," Ron said. He had the expression of someone who had been running words over in their head since they heard them, and arrived at a conclusion they didn't like. "About the defenses and a window," he said. "It has to be before they can act. He's going to move. I'm certain of it." Hermione and Harry looked at each other. "If Voldemort gets the stone," Harry said, "if he gets a body back, then Avalon doesn't matter," Hermione said. "A wraith directing a weak host is one thing. A wizard with a body, with strength, with the ability to act in the world, that is a different problem entirely. Everything we've found, the seal, the claim, none of that stops someone who can raise armies." She was very still in the way she got when the thinking had outpaced the speaking. "So we have to get there first." "Yes," Harry said, "but there's something else. The only thing that might stop Voldemort even without a body is what he already fears," Hermione said, "which is us, which is the claim." Harry looked at her. She looked back at him. "Tonight," he said. "Tonight," she agreed. Ron was already shaking his head, not in refusal, but in the rapid recalculation of someone updating their plan. "I'll stay above," he said, before either of them could speak. "I guard the trap door. If you don't come back in 2 hours, I go for Dumbledore. Not McGonagall. Dumbledore specifically." He looked at Harry. 2 hours. 2 hours, Harry said. Ron reached into his cloak pocket and set the white knight chess piece on the table between them. The chip in its base caught the candlelight. He left his hand on it for a moment, then took it away. They went. The third-floor corridor's locked door gave to Harry's wand. The harp was still playing, a continuous charm on it, someone's careful thinking, and the dog beyond was asleep, all three heads low, breathing with the deep regularity of something enchanted rather than merely tired. They passed it carefully, found the trap door in the floor, and jumped. The fall was short and the landing was soft, which was the first warning. Soft meant living, and living in the dark meant something designed to hold on. Hermione said sharply, "Still!" Harry was already struggling. The thing around his arms was plant material. Dense, fibrous, contracting steadily with the purpose of something that had evolved to kill by compression. He went still. "Devil's snare," she said. Her voice was calm in the way it was when she was moving faster than usual, and had decided calm was more efficient than anything else available. "Hates fire, hates light. Don't move." She drew her wand and produced bluebell flames, small, controlled, burning in a hovering point between her palm and the coiling mass. The warmth reached the vines before the light did. The snare released. Not gradually, all at once, the mass drawing back into the dark at the room's edges with the decision of something that had made a cost calculation and found it unfavorable. They stood in the cleared space. "Right," Harry said. "Keep moving," Hermione said. The next room was enormous in the way certain rooms in nightmares were enormous, not merely large but scaled for something larger than people. The chess pieces stood at shoulder height, made of stone, arranged on their starting squares with the patience of things that had been doing this a very long time, and expected to be doing it considerably longer. Harry had played wizard chess exactly 3 times in October, all badly, while Ron made corrections that were instructional in theory and documentary in practice. He understood the pieces' movements and approximately half of their psychology. He understood that they moved where directed, and that they fought in earnest, and that losing a piece here meant losing it permanently. Hermione stood at the board's edge and looked at it with the expression she wore when a problem was both interesting and moderately alarming. "I know the theory," she said. "I can calculate ahead in principle. But these pieces move like they're thinking, and a thinking opponent changes every calculation." "Let me read the field," Harry said. "That's what I do." She stepped back. He was not elegant. He played by feel as much as by calculation, reading the space between pieces the way he read the air on a broom, not for what was there, but for where the gap would open in 3 moves, the line of approach that didn't exist yet, but would. He sacrificed 2 of his own pieces to clear a diagonal before he understood why, understanding it only as the move resolved. He was wrong enough times that Hermione was quiet in a way that meant she was choosing not to say the thing she was thinking. One of her pawns was taken hard. A rook moved with the impersonal force of enchanted stone, and it came apart across 2 squares. She looked at it for 1 second, then looked back at the board. The path through opened on the 41st move. Harry wasn't counting. Hermione was. She said quietly, "There," and he saw it. They ran. The third room smelled of something acrid and old. Purple flames blocked the door ahead. Black flames sealed the way back. In the center of the floor, 7 bottles of varying sizes stood in an arc, and beside them a rolled piece of parchment. Hermione unrolled it. She read it once through, then again from the beginning. She set it flat on the floor and stood over it with her hands behind her back, in the posture she used when making the final check on work she was already certain of. "Most great wizards," she said, to the room in general, "have no more logic than the average garden gnome." "Can you solve it?" Harry said. "Yes." She was already moving along the row, reading shapes and contents against the positional clues. The clue about the smallest and the largest eliminates 4 immediately. The nettle wine information eliminates a 5th. The 2 remaining eliminate each other by position. She pointed to a bottle at the right end of the arc, small and dark, something faintly luminous inside. That one goes back. This one, the second from left, smaller still, goes forward. How long did that take you? She looked at the ceiling for a moment. 4 minutes, approximately. The forward bottle held enough for 2 careful halves. She divided it precisely, handed one to Harry, and they drank. The purple flames were cold rather than hot. They walked through and did not burn. The final door opened onto a room that was large and dark and very still. Against the far wall, occupying it the way something occupies a space it was made for, stood a mirror. It was as tall as a room and framed in gold, with an inscription running along the top that Harry couldn't read from here. The glass was perfectly clear and showed nothing except the room and themselves standing in it. Harry became aware, without knowing exactly how, that the reflection in the mirror was not simply a reflection. It showed them back accurately, and something else behind the accuracy, something in the glass that was attending to them in a way that a mirror didn't attend. The inscription along the top ran backwards, and he worked at it for a moment before he understood it wasn't meant to be read as text so much as experienced as a statement. I show not your face, but your heart's desire. They had arrived first. The room was empty, except for the mirror and the particular silence of a place that had been built to be used exactly once and had been waiting a long time for that moment. Hermione turned to say something to Harry. He was already watching the door behind them. It opened. There was a moment, standing before the mirror of Erist in that room's enormous quiet, when neither of them moved. Harry looked at the mirror. He saw himself, green eyes, dark hair, the lightning bolt scar where it always was, standing in what appeared to be this room exactly, in the dark, with this mirror behind him. In his reflected hand, the philosopher's stone. Red, smaller than he had imagined, catching the dim light with a warmth that was entirely its own. And behind his reflected self, standing at his right shoulder with an expression that was not triumph or desire but something quieter and more certain, was Hermione. Not as an object of wanting, as a simple truth. She was there because this was the truest picture of what he was now, and she was part of that, had been since September, and the mirror was only showing him back. He felt the stone appear in his pocket, small and dense and warm, exactly as it had looked. He closed his hand around it without reaching for it, without breaking his gaze from the glass. Then he looked away. "I have it," he said. Hermione had been watching the mirror alongside him, and her expression was careful. "I know," she said. The door behind them opened. Quirrell stood in the frame. He was breathing more quickly than usual, the run through the enchantments, and his purple turban was askew, and the difference about him was that his face was wrong. Not nervous. The affectation of anxiety that had been so consistent a feature of every lesson, every corridor sighting, every Thursday morning defense class, was simply absent. The face beneath it was younger and colder and quite still. His eyes moved across the room. They found Harry, then Hermione, then Harry again. He stopped. He looked at them for a moment, the way one looked at a calculation that had not resolved the way one expected. "2 children," he said. His voice had no stammer in it. How fitting for Merlin's cowardice, to hide behind a muggle-born and an orphan. Neither Harry nor Hermione said anything for the half-second it took Hermione to make a decision. She stepped forward. She was 12 years old and shorter than Quirrell by nearly a foot, and she looked at him with the expression she reserved for things that needed to be said precisely and without equivocation. "Merlin was Slytherin," she said. He was, and he spent his entire life using that power to protect Muggles. She didn't raise her voice. Her voice was very level. "So tell me, which part of his legacy is yours?" The room was quiet in the specific way it became quiet when a thing had been said that could not be unsaid. Quirrell's face went still. Something moved through his expression that was not his expression, a current beneath the surface, an attention that was not the attention of a 24-year-old defense teacher. He reached up and unwound the purple turban with the deliberation of someone setting aside a pretense they had been waiting to set aside for a long time. It fell to the floor in purple folds. The face at the back of Quirrell's skull was chalk white, flat-featured, noseless, with eyes that were red as a fire seen from inside, and a terrible quality of focused attention. It was not looking at the room. It was looking at Harry. "Give me the stone." The voice was not Quirrell's. Quirrell moved. He crossed the space between them fast enough that Harry's body responded before his mind did. Pure instinct. Seeker instinct. The reflex that closed on a thing before it could be taken. And his hands found Quirrell's arms above the wrists and held on. Quirrell screamed. The sound it made was not a sound a person made in ordinary pain. It was the sound of something encountering a thing it could not exist alongside, high and cracking and wrong, in a way that drove itself into the air and stayed there. Harry held on. He could feel it happening in his hands. Not heat from outside, but something from inside his own blood. Something his mother had made in her death that lived in him, and was now pressing itself against whatever Voldemort had made Quirrell into. His hands burned with it. He held on anyway. The skin under his grip blistered first, then cracked, then began to darken. Quirrell's arms were still in his grasp and pulling, and the face at the back of Quirrell's head shrieked a second time, and Harry set his teeth and did not let go. Hermione had her wand out. She was not going to touch Quirrell. This she had understood from the moment she understood what Harry's hands were doing and what hers would not do, but the room had gone wrong in ways that didn't require touching. Quirrell's dark reflex magic, the involuntary discharge of whatever had been using him for a year, was expressing itself in random directions. A crack running up the left wall, a concussive pulse along the floor, objects she couldn't identify moving at speed across the room at roughly head height. One of them passed close enough that she felt the air displacement. She put up a shield charm and held it. The charm wanted to give. She didn't let it give. She tracked the room, the cracks, the trajectories, the places where the floor was rippling, and kept the shield adjusted, and didn't look away from Harry, and didn't move toward him, and didn't touch Quirrell, and didn't let the shield drop. This was what she could do. She did it. "Hold on," she said. Quirrell's body lost its coherence with a quietness that seemed wrong given everything else. Starting at his hands and moving outward, the structure of him simply stopped. Not explosively, not with force, but with the finality of something that has been working against a conclusion it could not ultimately prevent. Harry had time to feel it happening, and to let go and step back before the process completed. The wraith left through them. It left the way warmth left a room in winter when all the fires went out at once, except in the opposite direction, not cold arriving, but something that carried cold with it as it passed, cold as the absence of everything living. It went through Harry and he staggered and caught himself against the wall, his shoulder hitting the stone hard, because what had just passed through him was the nearest thing to dead he had ever been in proximity to. Freezing water in every direction, simultaneously, from the inside. Then it was gone. The room was still. The dust was settling. The shield charm dissolved when Hermione let it go. What had been Quirrell was on the floor, and Harry was against the wall breathing, and neither of them moved for several seconds. Then, without a word exchanged, they both turned toward the mirror. The stone was still in Harry's pocket. He was aware of it the way he was aware of his own heartbeat. What the mirror showed had changed. It showed the room correctly. The two of them, standing, everything exactly as they were. And behind that accuracy, behind the literal reflection, it showed something else, with the same absolute clarity it had shown Harry's truest state before. A grey island under a winter sky, the low, dark hall of stone, 2 chairs cut from the rock of the island itself, rough and permanent and very old. In the chairs, 2 figures. Not detailed, an outline, a shape, an essence that was more certain than any specific feature. Recognizably them. Sitting in the chairs as though they had always been there and had simply been waiting for this particular moment to be visible. Hermione looked at it for a long time. "We don't need to sail there," she said. "The seal is already breaking. It's been breaking since we touched the door." Harry looked at her. "The claiming isn't a journey," she said. "It's a recognition. The bloodline was the condition, and the values were the proof. Merlin designed it this way. 2 heirs who shared his conviction, not just his blood. This room, this confrontation, the island's enchantment registered what we did here." She looked at the mirror. "The chairs are ours because we're already in them." Harry stood for a moment, with the stone in his pocket, and the mirror showing him the island under its grey sky, and the figure in the chair that was him in outline. He said, "So we've done it?" Hermione was quiet for a moment. The specific quiet she maintained when something was true but needed to be said right. "I think," she said, "Merlin would say the point was never the thrones. It was the people sitting in them." The mirror held the image still. The 2 chairs, the grey sky, the patience of stone that had been waiting over 1,000 years and had, at last, the right answer. The ceiling of the hospital wing was white and perfectly still, and Harry lay looking at it for a long moment before he remembered everything. His hands didn't hurt. He looked at them, turned them over, palm up, expecting damage, and found nothing. Clean skin, not even warmth. Whatever Lily Potter's sacrifice had pressed into him in the moment he held on to Quirrell had left no trace of itself in his body. The cost, if there was a cost, had been paid somewhere he couldn't reach. The matron noticed he was awake and came to check on him with the practiced efficiency of someone who had seen students in hospital beds in every variety of circumstance and had long since stopped being surprised by any of it. She satisfied herself that he was conscious and coherent, informed him he would be staying until morning, and returned to her work. Hermione was sitting at the foot of his bed. She had a book open, but was not reading it. She had been watching the ceiling in the same way he had. She looked at him when he moved. Her bushy brown hair was still uncombed from the previous night, and her school robes were slightly dusty. She looked, Harry thought, exactly like someone who had been through the dungeon enchantments and had not yet had time to look like anything else. "Good," she said. "Good," Harry said. Neither of them said anything else for a moment, and neither of them needed to. The hospital wing was quiet in the early morning. The light through the high windows was the pale, thin light of late spring. Harry lay in the white room and felt, under the strangeness and the exhaustion and the particular unreality of waking in a hospital bed, something he did not have a precise name for, a feeling like the end of a long and uncertain journey and the very first glimpse of where you had arrived. Dumbledore came at mid-morning. He moved through the ward with the measured pace of someone who was older than the castle and had never been in a hurry. He settled into the chair beside Harry's bed and folded his hands over his long silver beard and looked at them both. Harry in the bed, Hermione still at the foot of it, with an expression that was the closest thing to unguarded that Harry had ever seen from him. He explained the stone first. The arrangement had been a test, not only of Quirrell, but of the protections themselves, of whether the castle's enchantments held against an enemy who was already inside them. The mirror had been his specific work. The enchantment he had placed on it was, he said, one of the more elegant things he had managed. He did not say this with pride exactly, more with the tone of a craftsman, noting that a thing had held up under the conditions it was built for. Then he was quiet for a moment. "I was not wholly surprised," he said, "by what the hat found in you both." He looked at his hands. "I had suspected a living carrier existed somewhere. I had searched on 3 occasions and found no one. What I was not prepared for was 2, in the same house, in the same year." He looked up. "That has not happened in over 1,000 years. Not since the hat first existed." Harry thought about that. Over 1,000 years, from the founding of Hogwarts to this hospital bed, to a white ceiling on a May morning in 1992. A line that had crossed centuries in silence, waited through dozens of generations, and arrived at last in an 11-year-old boy and a 12-year-old girl who had found each other in a library in September. "What does it mean?" Harry said. "Being Merlin's heir. Being whatever it is we are to Avalon." Dumbledore's half-moon spectacles caught the light as he turned toward Harry. His blue eyes were steady and very calm. "Not a crown," he said. "Not a seat of power. A duty." He paused. Merlin was the most powerful wizard who ever lived, and he spent his life working for people who would never know his name. He believed the most powerful had the greatest obligation to those with none. He built the Order of Merlin on that principle, and he built the condition of Avalon's release on the same one. You could not have claimed it by bloodline alone. You had to earn it. Hermione from the foot of the bed. "And we did." "Yes," Dumbledore said. "You did." He was quiet for another moment, in the way he occasionally was when he was choosing his next words, not for what they said, but for how they would land. "There is something I should tell you both," he said. "Professor Snape intercepted Quirrell's forged note before you ever reached the dungeons in March. He has reported Quirrell's movements to me twice since February. Last night, he arrived in my office before either of you had returned." He folded his hands again. "Without his information, we would not have known the threat was moving as quickly as it was. What you found in the mirror room, you found because someone had already cleared the path that no one was supposed to see." Harry was silent. He looked at the ceiling. Snape's face came back to him. The resentment in it that was always there. And the other thing. The thing he didn't have a word for. The look of a man who kept his complicated things private. He did not say he was grateful. He was 11 years old, and it was not something he could say yet. But he did not argue. Hermione wrote 11 feet of parchment. The title was "The Historical Implications of the Prince's Line, Re-emergence in the Modern Wizarding World," and it ran across 3 tables in the library and had 23 footnotes, several of which referenced sources she had found in the restricted section and would need to return before term ended. Ron, who had read approximately the first 2 sentences, set it down and looked at her. "Hermione," he said, "no one is going to read this." "I know," she said. She was already footnoting the 24th entry. "I wrote it for me." Ron looked at the parchment for another moment. Then he picked up his chessboard. The end-of-year feast happened on a Thursday evening in the last week of June, and the Great Hall had the warm, slightly overwrought atmosphere of a large room full of students who had finished examinations and were going home in 3 days. Every table was full. The candles were bright. The long summer was immediately ahead. Harry sat at the Gryffindor table. Ron was arguing with Fred and George about something that had begun before dinner and showed no signs of resolving. Percy was reading at the end of the bench with the specific focus of someone who intended to remain above the argument. Neville was explaining the life cycle of a venomous tentacula to anyone who would listen, which was currently no one, but he seemed satisfied with the effort. Hermione was sitting across from Harry. She was not reading. She was looking at him in the way she sometimes looked at a problem that had resolved itself into something larger than the original question. Not satisfied exactly, but settled. Between them, the weight of everything they had found out since September, the weight of everything they were now, two of something ancient and ongoing and not entirely understood. Neither of them spoke. The feast continued around them. The Gryffindor table was loud in the way it was always loud, and the hall was full of students who knew nothing about what had happened in the dungeon, in the mirror room, in a corridor under the castle where a door had opened onto an island under a grey sky. The ordinary world went on at full volume. Harry looked at Hermione. She looked back. They had arrived at the end of a year that had begun with a boat crossing a black lake, a hat saying something neither of them understood, and a chocolate card with a picture of a dark witch on it. What it had become since then was not a thing that could be summarized at a feast table, with candles overhead and the noise of the school around them. It was not that kind of thing. The island did not announce itself. It had been present in the waters somewhere around Britain for over 1,000 years since the seal had been placed on it. Present and quiet and patient, the way things were patient when they had nothing to do but wait. The Darkstone Hall had stood through every winter and every summer since Morgan Le Fay's rule had ended, through the founding of the Statute of Secrecy, through every year that Hogwarts had sorted students who were not the right ones. The 2 chairs had been empty for all of it. They were not empty now. Not in body. Not yet. But the enchantment Merlin had placed in the island's oldest stone, the condition of the seal, the waiting for 2 who carried the blood and proved the values, had completed what it was built to do. The names were there. Inscribed in whatever it was that stone inscribed, in whatever it was that 1,000-year-old magic used as language. The island held the names as the last light of the day crossed the water and the summer went on, the way summers did, with all their particular indifference to the fact that something